Alright, so the story kicks off with this dude named Paul. He's living the good life as a successful businessman, picking up his teenage daughter Caitlin from high school. What people might not know, though, is that Paul wasn't always Mr. Law-abiding citizen. Back in the day, he was a big-shot mafia boss, respected, feared, all that jazz. But hey, he turned over a new leaf and decided to live a straight life for his family. Kind of like when you promise to eat just one cookie, but end up eating the whole pack. Except Paul stuck to his promise. Anyway, while they're driving home, Caitlin hits him with a request. She wants to invite two guy friends over, one of whom is named Mike, and brace yourself, Mike has a massive crush on her. Paul's like, sure, but only if they behave themselves. Dad mode activated. Fast forward a bit. Paul drops Caitlin off at home and heads to a cafe to hang out with his old pals, Kane and Francis. These guys were his partners in crime back in his mafia days. But don't worry, they've also swapped bullets for legit businesses since Paul decided to walk the straight and narrow. Turns out, Kane owns the cafe, and Paul wants to rent it out for Caitlin's birthday bash. Kane's like, dude, for you it's free. Party away. What a bro move, right? Later, Paul swings by the launch of his new business. Seriously, this guy's got his hands in everything. He's giving a heartfelt thank you speech to his investors and is basically the poster child for I've changed. Then he tells his wife they've been invited to dinner with some bigwigs, so they start getting ready. While she's doing her thing, Paul has a little heart-to-heart with Mike in the living room. Classic protective dad stuff. Do you do drugs? Are you in a gang? No. Cool. Just make sure Caitlin stays safe. Mike's sweating bullets, but manages to convince Paul he's clean. Phew. Now, here's where things take a dark turn. Paul and his wife are out at dinner, enjoying some fancy food, when a detective shows up. And not with good news. Caitlin's been kidnapped. Apparently, some thugs broke into their house, roughed up Mike and his buddy, and snatched her. Weirdly, they didn't take anything else, so it's clearly not a regular robbery. Paul rushes home to find the cops crawling all over the place and his wife throwing accusations like darts. She's convinced this is karma for Paul's past life as a mafia boss. Ouch. Paul's like, enough is enough. I'm gonna find her myself. The next day, he starts a search mission. First stop, Mike's house. But poor Mike's still shaken up and can't remember much about the kidnappers. Useless, right? So, Paul calls up Kane and Francis for backup. Time for the dream team to get back in action. They hit up this shady mob boss named Andrew to see if he knows anything. Andrew's like, nope, not me. And anyone dumb enough to mess with Paul must have a death wish. Even after some, convincing, Andrew sticks to his story. Looks like he's actually telling the truth for once. Meanwhile, somewhere else in town, a jogger stumbles across a body under a bridge. Yeah, things are getting worse. Back to Paul, Kane, and Francis. They've hit a dead end, despite grilling every crook in the city. And then the bombshell drops. Caitlin's body is found. It's devastating. Paul's world comes crashing down as he sees his daughter, lifeless. The funeral is gut-wrenching, with all of Paul's old and new friends showing up, including Frank, another mafia bigwig from the past. Frank pulls Paul aside and is like, don't do anything stupid. Let the cops handle this. Paul nods, but deep down, you know he's not about to sit around and wait. The plot thickens when Kane reminds Paul of something shady they did 2 decades ago, robbing and killing the brother of a Russian mafia boss. Paul brushes it off, saying, nah, no one saw us, so it can't be that. Meanwhile, the detective gets some forensic results. Caitlin was killed with a Soviet gun, which screams Russian mafia louder than a guy yelling at a bear in Siberia. Oh, Paul's like, all right, game on. He gathers Kane and Francis, and they march into a Russian-owned bar, guns blazing. They take out everyone in sight. It's brutal, but Paul's convinced this is justice for Caitlin. Back home, he tells his wife to leave town until things cool down. She's like, is it over? And Paul, looking like he just walked out of an action movie, says, nope, this is just the beginning. The trio keeps digging and plans their next move. They're on the hunt for a guy who used to work as a driver for the Russian mafia boss's brother. Alright, so Francis finally gets a lead on where this guy Danny, the driver they're hunting down, is hiding. Without wasting time, the squad heads straight to Danny's spot. Paul, being the boss he is, tells Kane and Francis to chill in the car while he goes solo to chat with Danny. But guess what? Danny takes one look at Paul and bolts like he just saw a ghost. Francis, clearly not the patient type, whips out his gun and fires a shot to stop him. Talk about making an entrance, huh? Paul sprints after Danny, and eventually, the poor guy ends up cornered. At this point, Paul hits him with a bombshell confession. "Yeah, I'm the guy who robbed and killed Chernov's brother 2 decades ago." Danny's eyes practically pop out of his head, and he spills the tea. Thanks to Paul's actions, the Soviets have been torturing him all these years because they thought he did it. Talk about wrong place, wrong time. Paul asks the burning question, "Are the Soviets behind my daughter's deaths?" But before Danny can even open his mouth to respond, Francis pulls another trigger. Yep, Danny's gone. Paul's like, "Seriously, dude? He was our only lead." Francis, probably shrugging, doesn't seem too bothered. The next day, Paul's grabbing coffee when a detective swings by for a little heart-to-heart. He's like, "Listen, man, going all John Wick on people isn't going to bring your daughter back." He even warns Paul that if he keeps this up, he's heading straight to jail. Paul, being the cool and slightly unhinged guy he is, doesn't flinch. He's got bigger fish to fry. Later that night, Paul and the crew decide to wreck the Soviets' drug operation. They crash the party and start taking everyone out. Guns blazing, chaos everywhere. By the end of it, one of the key players in the Soviets' operation is out of the picture. The next morning, the police are on the scene, scratching their heads. The detective, who's pretty sure Paul's behind the bloodbath, secretly feels a bit relieved since these were bad guys the cops had been after anyway. It's like Paul's running his own vigilante justice program. Meanwhile, back at Soviet HQ, Chernov, the big boss, is getting reports that his business is being torn apart by some rogue group. He's confused, probably wondering, who the heck is crazy enough to mess with me? Spoiler, it's Paul. Chernov orders his men to track these guys down and deal with them. That afternoon, the Soviets show up at Kane's bar, and things immediately heat up. Kane calls Paul, letting him know what's going down, but Paul's also trying to get hold of Francis, who's conveniently not answering his phone. Kane, left to fend for himself, takes on the Soviets. But let's face it, one guy against a whole crew? Yeah, it doesn't end well. By the time Paul arrives, he sees Kane being stuffed into the trunk of a car like he's luggage. Paul, being the action hero he is, starts chasing them, but the cops show up and stop him. Here's the twist. The detective lets Paul go. Turns out Paul once saved his life, and besides, Paul's chaos is conveniently targeting criminals the cops want gone anyway. 2 birds, 1 stone, right? Kane, meanwhile, isn't having a great time. He's being tortured by the Soviets, who want to know why he and his buddies decided to mess with their business. Kane stays quiet for a while, but eventually the pain is too much. He spills everything, saying, "This all started because you killed Paul's daughter." Cue Chernov's confusion. "Wait, what? I didn't kill his daughter," he says, scratching his head. When Kane explains that this is all connected to Paul and his crew killing Chernov's brother years ago, Chernov loses it. Now he's furious for a whole new reason. Chernov decides it's time to have a chat with Frank, a mafia boss and Paul's old buddy. Back in the day, Frank and Paul used to work together, and Chernov figures Frank might owe him some answers. Meanwhile, Paul finally tracks down Francis, only to find him chilling with a call girl. Paul's fuming. "Really? When I'm out here losing my mind, this is what you're doing?" Francis tries to explain that he needed a break from all the drama, but Paul's not buying it. Things escalate quickly, and Paul accuses Francis of betrayal, especially for killing Danny, their key lead. Francis denies it at first, but when Paul keeps pushing, he snaps. They end up fighting, and in the scuffle, Paul accidentally stabs Francis, killing him. Talk about awkward. While Paul's dealing with his own mess, Chernov and Frank meet up. Chernov shows up with Kane's lifeless body, R.I.P. Kane, blaming Frank for being involved in his brother's murder all those years ago. Frank denies everything, saying he had nothing to do with it, but Chernov's not convinced. Things turn ugly, and bullets start flying. Let's just say it doesn't end well for anyone involved. That night, Paul's alone, haunted by memories of the past, specifically the moment he killed Chernov's brother. He suddenly remembers something crucial. He kept Chernov's gun as a trophy. Rushing home, Paul checks the gun and realizes it's been moved. Worse, the bullets match the ones that killed Caitlin. The truth finally hits him. Caitlin's death wasn't the Soviets' doing. It was her own friends. Paul confronts Mike, one of Caitlin's friends, and cleverly lures him into admitting the truth. Turns out that night, Mike and his buddy got drunk and started playing with Paul's old gun after Caitlin bragged about her dad's mafia days. One thing led to another, and Mike accidentally shot Caitlin. In a panic, they dump her body under a bridge and stage the whole thing to look like a mafia kidnapping. Mike, devastated by guilt, breaks down and confesses everything. Paul, surprisingly calm, forgives Mike. He realizes it was a tragic accident and chooses to walk away instead of seeking more revenge. When he gets home, he calls his wife to tell her it's all over and apologizes for everything. Deep down, Paul knows that all his actions, the bloodshed, the chaos, were fueled by his guilt over dragging his friends into a life that eventually destroyed them. Now, he just wants peace, even though he knows Chernov's crew might still be coming for him. And that's the wild, messy ride that is Paul's story. A mix of revenge, guilt, and redemption, all wrapped up in chaos.